Welcome to the Mina Kimes Show featuring Lenny, the only NFL podcast where ball don't lie is something one of our hosts said after he got fixed. Doesn't really add up, actually. You may have heard his voice there. I was saying hello to you, the listener, but I guess Field also took it as a hello. Welcome back to the show, Field Yates.
Sorry, I got really excited, Mina.
And the music does it.
I recently consumed a nice coffee. It's 12:30 where I am right now. I look forward to a lot of things in life, but nothing more than being on the Mina Kimes Show. One of your 8 podcasts. It's a real honor. You do a 12:30 iced coffee? That is playing fire. I early start this morning here on Bristol campus. So this feels like my afternoon pick me up, but when it's just barely afternoon. So there might be a third cup coming later today.
Field, I think I haven't been keeping track of appearances. Golo is, first of all, something that I'd like to experiment with later. But Gojo and Dominique, I think, are neck and neck for repeats, but I'm pretty sure you're a close third.
I feel like I'm definitely in your top 5. I feel like for sure Dominique and Gojo are your top recurring guests. I feel like Bill Barnwell probably has been on the show a few times. Obviously he does
not as
the
much
Daily
as you.
Show.
No, not as much as you. Not as much as you.
It's about time I did something better than Bill, right? It's about time. So Bill, your day in the sun has come and gone. It's my time.
Today is actually going to be a split episode. Haven't done one of those in a while. We're going to have Field at the top half, and then the second half of the show, making his Mina Kimes Show featuring Lenny debut, is Get Up producer, researcher Paul Hembekides. I think I said his last name right. Also known as Hembo. And Field, I feel like this is actually a really good structural conceit for the two of you, because what I decided to do for this episode is we're going to have you on to talk about things in the NFL that are underrated, which, you're like a really positive, good-natured guy. So that feels right for your energy. And then Hembo is going to come on later to just slap a bunch of things down and say what's overrated.
And by the way, Hembo fears not. He just does not in life. Like when I say, what does he not fear? A lot of things. Nothing. He fears nothing. Hembo is not afraid to call it like he sees it or as the numbers bear out. And by the way, I like that you had to say, I think I'm pronouncing his last name right, because I think that's right as well. Obviously, many people know Woj at ESPN, but no one knows how to pronounce Woj's last name properly. You just got to say it like you're saying it properly, like Wojnarowski, and people be like, yeah, that's close enough. So Hembo, we just call him Hembo because I think it's Hembekides. I think you're right.
It is. He sent me a pronunciation guide. It's right in front of me.
Amazing.
But yeah, Field Yates is obviously the easiest name. Field Yates, we joke a lot about his name. That's like a TV quarterback name. That's just so easy to say. But yeah, I'm excited to talk about these. We're going to kind of be focusing on, I think, overrated, underrated things that'll be relevant in the postseason. But before we get to that, and I'm going to let you go first, Field. I want to tell you guys about a couple of podcasts. Geez, wow, I am crushing it today. Go low indeed. One is ESPN Daily. That's the daily show I host, 20 minutes every day, a different story. Today is a very special episode with Josh Hermsmeyer of 538 talking about the return of the fullback. It's a deeply gritty episode. And then I'd also like to remind you to check out The Right Time with Bomani Jones. This week, Bo addresses the controversy at the Army-Navy game and the possibility that Urban Meyer makes a jump to the NFL. Download and subscribe to The Right Time wherever you get your podcasts. Okay, Field, who's underrated?
Well, so Mina, this was, I'm not going to tell you that I didn't have an idea you're going to mention the podcast from this morning, which I'd encourage people to listen to as well. But very much on topic here is CJ Ham is underrated for the Vikings. So by the way, just to further this, and hopefully I'm not spoiling anything here, Mina, when we were discussing the topics, the idea was to try to keep it within the playoff relevant team vein.
Yes.
That's a fair just sort of note to mention as people are wondering, how do you decide what's underrated? Are you talking about food? Are you talking about TV shows? No.
Oh, yeah. We should also, I'm just going to throw this out as a caveat. This is underrated, overrated is an extreme, like, straw man situation. Like,
sure.
You can say anything is underrated or overrated, based on the internet. It's basically just stuff we want to talk about.
Yeah, exactly. So, I took that and I sort of forwarded it with playoff teams in mind, or teams that are very much alive in the playoff mix. And with the fullbacks in mind, CJ Ham got me thinking about how useful and impactful he's been for the Vikings this year. And people are probably wondering, like, how are you going to quantify the impact of a fullback? And, well, the answer is we don't have to fully quantify it. Some of it is just you know it when you see it. But he's been useful for them in the passing game. He's got 15 catches this year, does Ham. He found the end zone as well. Promptly celebrated with 30 front squats and a couple of, what else? Deadlifts. Some deadlifts as well from CJ Ham. But the Vikings are at the top of the NFL in terms of percentage of plays with two backs on the field, and we're defining a back as a running back or a fullback, so he's a huge part of what they do. Not a major surprise given the roots of Gary Kubiak, who's now on their coaching staff there and helping along with Kevin Stefanski, their offensive coordinator. And, you know, a couple of years ago, this Vikings offensive line was super maligned, right? It was if they could only find one good offensive lineman. Now the offensive line seems to be a perceived area of strength, which is the truth, Mina, but the fullback has been a big part of it as well. And CJ Ham, who is a player that has been homegrown by Minnesota, has really had his best season yet, and I think that's a big part of what they do in the running game. And the running game has continued to be effective, whether it was Dalvin Cook, whether it was Alexander Mattison, and then most recently Mike Boone, who stepped in and had 2 touchdowns this past weekend when Cook got hurt, and Madison was already out in that game against the Chargers. So this is sort of maybe a deep cut here with underrated, but CJ Ham's value should not be overlooked when you're assessing what he means to that offense.
Right, and I think it's not just CJ Ham, the player. It's sort of the concept of the position and how it's used, right?
Sure.
By the way, CJ Ham, the player, caught 2 passes for 42 yards against the Seahawks. One was a particular indignity, as I remember. But, you know, the reason we did the podcast, The Daily Show today on fullbacks was someone pointed out that the 4 teams that use fullbacks the most are the Vikings, the Saints, the Ravens, and the Niners. Pretty good offenses, Field.
Yeah,
and
seriously.
you know, it's not that they happen to have just these like explosive, unbelievable fullbacks. It's that all of those offenses are very good at using fullbacks in interesting, surprising ways. They use them, yes, as lead blockers at times. I mean, I pointed out the Ravens used Ricard to lead Lamar into the end zone, which is not something you see every day with quarterbacks. But also, they use them to diagnose offenses, which the Vikings do a lot with Ham. And then they use them to, I think, dictate what defenses give them. And Shanahan is particularly genius at them, right? Forcing defenses to go into base against heavy and then passing out of it. And it's kind of undeniably a powerful trend at this point.
Yeah, it certainly has been. I completely agree with everything that you just said there, Mina. And you used the word dictate just a moment ago. And my sort of like old football saying, or I don't even know if it's old, it's just something that I've believed in, is that at its really simplest form, offensive football is done successfully when a team is able to dictate. Defensive football is played successfully when a team is able to react, right? Ultimately, one team knows what's coming. The other team has to find out what is coming and subsequently do its best to deter that. And a fullback can be a big part of it, Mina. And there are I think we're making a lot of advancements in metrics and ways that we can sort of look at the game a little bit more analytically. But there is something that I think is never going to be fully quantifiable, but is always going to be somewhat apparent, which is just sort of the psychological impact of just overwhelming your opponent at the line of scrimmage. And I think the Cowboys this past week against the Rams were a great example of that. Like, Rams talents.
I'm going to get to that.
Yeah.
I'm going to get to that. That's I'm going to talk about the Cowboys line.
There you go.
The show.
So we'll talk about it in a second.
But not as an overrated thing, but as a compliment. Yeah.
Yeah. So just the idea that, like, and again, I'm probably sort of scribbling outside the lines here a little bit, but I just think that there is something to be said for completely and physically overwhelming your opponent.
Body blows.
Body blows.
Well, that's a good segue actually to my underrated, my first underrated person, which, since we're giving the Vikings some love, it's Kirk Cousins. Okay, so last week, yeah, I'm doing it. Last week, Field, I was on Get Up, and they were asking us to put together a list of the top 5 quarterbacks, like now, this season, at this moment, just not of all time, not of in the NFL, but just now. And I kept trying to not put Kirk Cousins on my list, and the statistics wouldn't let me. You know what I mean? Like, I kept moving around the numbers, looking at different, I guess, metrics, thinking through different games, thinking through opponents, and it's just impossible at this point because I realize in the past, Kirk Cousins, I've said this before on this podcast, has been the quarterback who's much better statistically than he is in big moments, which I hate saying that because he's the quarterback who annoys you if you like analytics. But this season, I think he's showed up in every regard. Because last season, his numbers were good, but he was really dinking and dunking often. And then the season before, he was making a lot of mistakes. This season, he's done neither. He is third in completion percentage over expected, which is a stat we like from Next Gen Stats. He ranks in the top 5 in just about every metric, and he's throwing the ball downfield. Now, some people say, well, his receivers are getting a lot of yak, and setting aside the fact that Adam Thielen has been out a lot, which I think factors into that, I feel like people underestimate, and this is from watching Cousins, how much a perfectly placed throw allows receivers to rack up yak. So to me, he's just having an excellent season, and I think he doesn't get enough credit.
Yeah, to that point about where the ball is placed and what that allows a quarterback or a wide receiver or pass catcher to do after the catch, I always think of Kurt Warner and how his accuracy during the Greatest Show on Turf, it was like
totally.
If he needed Torrey Holt or Isaac Bruce to actually pivot back because of how the defender, where the leverage was of the defense, he would put the ball maybe behind them to sort of, hey, I am enticing you to shift your weight or your momentum to go the other way. I always think about that when I think of quarterback and ball placement specifically. I agree. It's weird. It's weird calling Kirk Cousins underrated because it's going to be, Monday Night Football. The stars are aligning here, Mina, right? Because you say something nice about him and then he plays on the national spotlight.
I know. He's going to have a stinker.
Yeah, but you never know. I mean, and they're playing at home. That should be a boon to them. And the fact that Adam Thielen presumably is fully healthy, even though he only played 50% of the snaps this past week, the game was kind of out of hand. So I'm with you. I am on board with Kirk Cousins having a better season than people are currently giving credit for. And my second underrated thing here, Mina, and again, I'm trying to keep things that are not being discussed ad nauseum here, is so the Texans this offseason saw Tyrann Mathieu sign a 3-year deal with the Chiefs for $42 million. A lot of people thought that the Texans would just keep Mathieu because, hey, he was a really good player for them last year. He's a really good player in general. Plus, they have all this cap space, right? Deshaun is still on his rookie contract, et cetera, et cetera. But they ended up losing Mathieu in free agency, and they signed Tashawn Gibson, who had been cut by the Jaguars this past offseason, one of several moves that Jacksonville made, and the bloodletting of that defense has obviously continued since then. But Gibson's been really good for them, and I don't know if their secondary is sort of revered or feared even as others are that are in the they're in the playoff mix, right? I mean, certainly the Patriots and the Bills are some of the best we have right now in the NFL. The 49ers, when they're healthy, are an excellent secondary amongst other groups. But Gibson's been a useful player for Houston this year. Actually, a lot of the players that are sort of overlooked, like we've seen in spurts recently, like Jacob Martin, who I know you know, part of the Jadeveon Clowney trade. Like there have been guys that have just none of them are probably going to go to the Pro Bowl. None of them will be players that are discussed as top of the market type guys if they were free agents, but players that have been more resourceful and more useful than we realize, which is part of the reason why Houston, I think, has been in moments pretty good defensively. They've also had some bad moments, but they've had some good moments that have been notable. I think back to that Patriots game, for example, on Sunday Night Football when they completely dominated New England.
I think that's really astute. I mean, the Texans, last week I talked about how they're kind of the new Titans and that who the heck knows what they are week to
Nobody
week,
knows.
Right? They're really the highest variance playoff team, I think, of it at this point, because the ceiling you get with Watson, Hopkins, and when Fuller's on the field is so ridiculously high that you really can't count them out. But then every now and then even the offense will put up a dud. And certainly the defense is regarded as a weakness of the team. But you're right to say there are a few guys on this defense who have stepped up. And by the way, they could get J.J. Watt back. I don't know what are you hearing with that?
The latest, well, they got to make the playoffs first, which certainly they have an excellent chance with that win this past weekend. But yeah, it's possible. I mean, Bill O'Brien has now acknowledged it, that he gave the canned answer, which is JJ's working really hard, and we'd love to see him back on the field. But still, it's at least possible, which seemed unthinkable when he went on IR because of the pec injury. And heck, he even announced it. I mean, he took to Twitter to say it kills me that I can't be with my guys this year. But there's always a chance.
There's a chance. And yeah, actually, one of the names, Gibson's a really smart one. And one of the names that I was actually going to mention, I was thinking about it, was Zach Cunningham, the linebacker who just flashes a lot. And I still don't think it's a strength, but I think you're right that there are a few players that this defense could have been terrible, and they're not.
Right.
And I think it's because of those performances. So for my next one, I'm going to go defense as well. And this one is an insane straw man. And I'm really only doing it because I got in a fight with a bunch of people on Twitter. And that's the Bills' pass defense.
Nice.
Now, I don't think they're underrated. I just think we don't talk about them enough. And that's been going on for a couple years. And after the Steelers game Field, I said something to that effect. By the way, Tre'Davious White should be the face of this team. He is the best player on the team.
He is their best player, yeah.
Yeah, he's their best player. And then a bunch of Steelers fans were like, whoa, anyone looks good against Duck Hodges, right? And that bothers me for a couple of reasons. So I pointed out the Bills defense has allowed the second lowest passer rating, the lowest rating on deep passes, the second lowest number of pass touchdowns. By the way, if you want to say it was just the Steelers, they held the Ravens to 209 yards of total offense and 105 passing yards. They have not allowed more than 260 passing yards all season. They are very, very good. And I also really hate the thing where we pretend you can't learn things about good teams when they play bad teams. You can't take them out of context. If the Bills had been bad all season, you can't say they're good now. But good teams dominate bad teams. And I do think there's something to learn from that.
The Ravens steamrolled a bunch of teams in succession. Several of them were really bad, and yet that was a huge part of when the Lamar narrative, which is it's not a narrative, it's a fact, when his MVP candidacy totally skyrocketed. So yeah, bad teams. The NFL, if you look, I think personally, if you look at the NFL closely this year, there's 12 to 14 teams that are okay, that are good, I should say. And then it kind of bottoms out really quickly. I do and I think you do as well. You're part of the power rankings voters each week, and it's hard. If you look, as I was doing this on Monday morning, it's how do you rank the Colts, for example, right? They're not a top 12 or 13 team when you just start to rattle off names, but they're not that far behind either because there's just a bunch of really average football teams. One thing I'll say about the Bills' pass defense, and I know people use this analogy in basketball where you talk about a defense playing on a string, right? One player moves right, that in turn brings another player along with him or whatever. There's rotations. You guys know what I'm talking about. The Bills' pass defense, not literally a string because football defense is not the same, but there's a lot of harmony. It feels like each of the four core players, and we know that in football it's often more than four defensive backs on the field, but of the guys that are sort of their primary secondary players, sort of a weird way of putting it, but you know what I'm saying as well there. They all just seem to always know where they're supposed to be, and they actually are there in a given play, which is part of why they're so successful.
That's a great point. I also want to just get one thing before you move on to your next one. They're cheap. This is a well-built unit. 10% of the cap in Buffalo is on the secondary. That ranks 26th in the NFL. I think Jordan Poyer and Micah Hyde could go down as, they were signed, I want to say within weeks, right?
Same offseason.
2017.
Yep.
Good Lord. That's going to go down as an incredible sign. Obviously, Tre'Davious White was a first-round pick, but these guys are all locked down for at least a couple of years. So that, I think speaks to, this is a whole other, Barnwell and I talked about this on Monday. Just the team building there has been unbelievable. So just want to put a pin on that as well.
Huge fans of what they're doing right now in Buffalo. There's just such good harmony between the front office, the coaching staff, and there's a lot of talent too, which is certainly important. Another underrated thing, or I guess my third and final underrated thing for right now, Mina, is Boston Scott. And you're probably like, dude, no, we're talking about Miles Sanders right now. But no, how cool is this? This is such a great story here for Philly. Boston Scott, Greg Ward, I mean, all these guys who are contributing right now that no one would have expected it. But Boston Scott, 2 game weeks ago, so week 14, when the Eagles played the Giants, the Eli return game, he might have been the best offensive player on the field other than Darius Slayton, or maybe along with Darius Slayton, which who would have thought that going into the season, that a game that featured Saquon Barkley and amongst other players.
Love him.
Yeah.
Love him. He's electric. He's like my
awesome.
favorite rookie, yeah.
So the thing about like Boston Scott, like it's really hard to compare someone to Darren Sproles because Darren Sproles is awesome and amazing and was so incredible during his career, I presume, which I think is over now, but we'll see whether he returns for next season. But whenever a guy is short and he plays running back, we inevitably draw comparisons between he and Darren Sproles. Boston Scott's not Darren Sproles. Let me be very clear right now. But the fact that he is this pint-sized running back whose best value comes in the passing game and looks like he's shot out of a cannon whenever he gets the football, I think is really important to Philadelphia right now because as much as they have the playoffs within their grasp, it's still a team that has massive offensive question marks right now. As of this recording, Nelson Aguilar is uncertain to play on Sunday against the Cowboys. So we need to stop looking at who's available amongst the Eagles wide receivers. Mina, it's more just like what players that can catch passes are available to Carson Wentz in Philly, and especially if Jordan Howard sits out again, like good for Boston Scott. This guy deserves some love. A 6th-round pick out of Louisiana Tech who has made his mark now with this first real opportunity in the NFL.
Total credit to him, to Greg Ward. Is it Greg Ward Jr.?
Greg Ward Jr.,
right?
That's right. Yeah.
Greg Ward Jr. Gotta get the junior right. And to honestly Doug Peterson and Micro, because talk about turning chicken you-know-what into chicken salad in Philadelphia. And I was a big Arcega-Whiteside fan in college, and that's been a struggle. That's a whole other thing. I don't know what's going on with there. I mean, he's got they have no wide receivers, and he has 7 targets over the last 3 weeks.
I'm a patience guy depressing. Here. It's just like it's like some things come easily to players as a rookie, and then a lot of players just need a full year. Mina, it's a hugely different game.
Yeah,
I know that's sort of intuitive,
especially him.
But we recalibrate expectations when we have things. Like Saquon Barkley last year come in and be the best running back in football right away, or guys who make an immediate impact at some position as a rookie. It just makes us forget how difficult it is to actually be a useful rookie in the NFL.
I agree. I also think it's interesting to compare him to a DK Metcalf, right? Where both guys had very limited route trees, super vertical, contested catch guys. But DK Metcalf had the benefit of being the number 2 and not, I think being used correctly by the Seattle, right? Which actually brings me to my final underrated thing. The Seahawks passing attack.
Yeah, I like it.
No one talks about this. Number 1 in pass offense, according to Football Outsiders. Now, it's interesting with the Josh Gordon news, and for those who don't know, Josh Gordon has been, I think, suspended indefinitely, right?
Yeah. It's a sad story.
It's just super sad. There's really nothing else. It's just sad. There's really nothing. There's no takes to be had on it, in my opinion. It's just kind of...
I feel the same way.
Really unfortunate. But just kind of going to the team and the football perspective, I think last week, and again, he had a huge catch in this game, but I think what you also saw was Tyler Lockett finally looked healthy. And that Tyler Lockett, Russell Wilson connection, when it's firing, again, makes life a lot easier for Metcalf, who also had a big game. Tyler's catching 78% of Wilson's passes. Most of the players above him are tight ends. That's not, and then Michael Thomas.
Right.
That's not a wide receiver number. And Wilson just this year has been so unbelievable on deep passes. A lot of that is Lockett. But you've had guys dropping deep passes from him over the last couple of weeks. I think people were saying, Wilson had a couple regression games. No, if Malik Jackson and a couple other guys actually caught his passes, his numbers would look very different. But his deep passing numbers are insane this year. And I think it's something people kind of underrate about this team.
I think so too, Mina, and I have a theory that is, I'd say, fairly straightforward why, is that Lockett has been amazing. He's also had some really quiet stretches, right? Prior to this past week, he had 8 catches for 107 yards in 4 total games prior to it. So very quiet stretch for Tyler Lockett. Besides Lockett, there's no signature member of this receiving core. And I get it, Metcalf is well known, but he's partially well known because he had sort of this legend about him before he even became an NFL draft pick with his, sort of, like Zeus-like stature, right? So I think the lack of an identifiable dominant pass catcher that has been that way all year is part of it, and the depth, right? Like, part of the reason why they claim Josh Gordon is because they have a lot of guys that are catching passes, but not necessarily a lot of guys that are every single snap players. So between Jerron Brown and David Moore and Tyler Lockett and Turner and Gordon while he was with the team and Jacob Hollister and Will Dissly, it's like this team just pieces it together. They just find a way, which I think is part of the reason why. It's not where you watch the Saints offense and they're amazing in the passing game, but you also just sort of you can't find words to describe Michael Thomas anymore. That I think is a contributing factor to it. It's just sort of the recognizability of a lot of the guys doing it.
All right, Field. Thank you so much for joining us, and as always, spreading goodwill and joy wherever you go.
I appreciate that, Mina. And for all those that are sticking around for the rest of this podcast, which you should be, here comes the good stuff. Now we bring in Hembo.
All right, guys. As most of us have found out the hard way, getting into debt is easy, getting out is hard, especially if your credit score isn't great. Thankfully, now there's Upstart.com, the revolutionary lending platform that knows you're more than just your credit score and offers smarter interest rates to help you pay off high-interest credit card debt. Upstart goes beyond the traditional credit score when assessing your credit worthiness. They actually reward you based on your education and job history in the form of a smarter interest rate. Upstart believes you're more than just your credit score. They believe in you, and they understand that. They make it fast, simple, and easy to check your rate in just a few minutes. The best part? Once the loan is approved and accepted, most people get the funds the very next business day. The next day! Over 300,000 people have used Upstart to pay off credit cards or meet their financial goals. Free yourself from the burden of high-interest credit card debt by consolidating everything into one monthly payment with Upstart. See why Upstart is ranked number 1 in their category with over 300 businesses on Trustpilot. And hurry to upstart.com/Mina to find out how low your Upstart rate is. Checking your rate only takes a few minutes and it will not affect your credit. That's upstart.com/Mina.
Question. Lenny, for your thoughts.
All right. As always, I will take questions from listeners. I'm just taking them by myself today because we're kind of in between guests and it's just me today. So hope that's okay. Alana Robbins, well, it's either Alana or Alan A. Robbins. Interesting game you're playing there. Asks, for my number 1 fantasy pro tip. Well, Alan or Alana, it's funny you asked that because I just advanced to my fantasy championship and I beat, on the process of doing so, I beat Danny B. Kelly of The Ringer, who hosts a fantasy podcast on The Ringer. I'm so excited I can't even get the words out. It's called the Fantasy Podcast. You guys should check it out. In any case, I largely beat him for a couple of reasons. Mark Ingram and Jameis Winston. Also because it's a dynasty league and my team is kind of a win now roster. And so I traded my first round draft pick next year for Travis Kelce and Kenyon Drake. And Kenyon Drake ended up getting me 40 points, which was honestly hilarious. I think my number 1 pick is to look less at players and look more at the offenses and offensive lines and the coaches that they're playing for. Something I was excited to see what Drake would do in Arizona. He's crushed it. Murmur00 asks, which NFL player or coach is Lenny most likely to heckle? So, producer Dan had a good suggestion. Chandler Catanzaro, the kicker, but I'm not sure he's in the league anymore. So that feels like piling on. I'll go with Todd Gurley, who is a self-described cat dude. It just feels very on brand. Astral Korea asks, what is the best movie of 2019 and why is it Parasite? Parasite is excellent. You guys should absolutely see it. Don't look up any information about it. It's like a perfect film because it's both nerdy and smart. You think about it, but it's also immensely entertaining and sort of thrilling. So that would definitely be up there for me. I also just watched Once Upon a Time in Hollywood and absolutely loved it. And I don't love every Tarantino film. I just watched The Hateful Eight and only got through about 30 minutes before falling asleep. But this one is truly excellent. It's really funny, too. Kay Pence asks, why do you pick up a Canadian accent? So the word that I get this on a lot is, I'm going to say it not the way I normally say it now, but it's about. And I have a tendency to sort of say a boot, I think, or kind of get somewhere in between about and boot, which I know is a Canadian thing. Also, I had Zach Lowe on ESPN Daily, and I think I said Russell Westbrook instead of Russell Westbrook, which is obviously a hilarious nickname also. I don't know. I don't really have any regional accent. I think it's because I moved around a lot as a kid. My dad was in the military, so I grew up in like 10 different places, and I think probably picked up weird tics and dialect sort of tendencies everywhere I went and ended up with a weird, flat, vaguely Canadian voice. Andrew Petzel asks, great question, if you could be any Monopoly piece, what would it be and why? So playing Monopoly as a kid, I always chose the dog, obviously, but I don't want to choose a Scotty to offend Lenny. I've always liked the thimble solely because you can kind of put it on your pinky. I have really small fingers. Nurse Vanessa, last one, before we get to Hembo, asks, how do we feel about the Texans GM council? I just love thinking of it as a council, like the Jedi High Council, when thinking of Bill O'Brien wearing like luxurious robes, like a deep burgundy robe, perhaps, with Baby Yoda trying to advise him from the corner. So we have, made fun of this a lot on this show, this sort of notion that the Texans are doing all these deals or have done all these deals without a GM. And I think at some point in the offseason, I want to take a step back and look at all of the in-season trades and kind of figure out what to make of them. I don't think it's possible to adjudicate who won which trade during the season, even though a lot of those players have made impacts on the teams they've gone to. And like, for example, Tunsil in Houston, he's been good. He has a lot of penalties, but he's been a very good pass blocker. But just sort of generally, I guess it seems clear to me it's better to have a GM than not a GM. I mean, it's not like Bill O'Brien is doing the cap math by himself with a TI-83. They have guys in Houston who do that. But undoubtedly it would be good to have a GM. But the thing is, it wouldn't be good if it was a bad GM. So I think having a good GM is better than no GM is my answer, which seems really obvious. Okay, let's get to Hembo. All right, we are back, and we are joined by a first-time guest on the Mina Kimes show featuring Lenny. This is his maiden voyage. His name is Paul Hembekides. Pretty sure I pronounced that right.
That is exactly correct.
You probably know him. Did I get it right? Okay, you probably know him as Hembo. Hembo is what everyone... Have people called you Hembo your whole life?
No, I've been called Hembo since the first day that I ever researched Mike and Mike. I showed up one morning at like 5:15 with the rest of them. Greeny and Golick asked me what my name was. I said Paul Hembekides. They say, we're not calling you that. And Golick said Hembo. And literally since that time, I've only been known as that. It was that flippant, and it's lasted this long.
Could be worse, honestly.
Much.
Could be worse. Yeah. Well, so Paul's a producer on Get Up. He helps a lot of folks with stats and research, and we like stats and research here on the Mina Kimes show. He's also, I feel like Field came on to do the underrated half of the show because, Field is like sunshine and daisies. He is just a ray of light and positivity in all of our lives, and you are the storm cloud that hangs over that show. So I thought you'd be good to do things that are overrated. And I'll remind our listeners, I'm very well aware that overrated and underrated are entirely subjective, fallacy-prone sort of bars to set, but it's my show, and that's how we're doing it. So this is the overrated section. And Paul, I want you sent me your ideas last night, and honestly, one of them was so flaming hot, it singed my eyebrows off, basically, because you sent it to me last night. So tell the listeners what that is.
I think that the Saints passing game, Drew Brees, is overrated. And I have to say this, as much as I enjoyed his coronation over achieving that fake record last night, for which he became the most accomplished compiler in the NFL history, I maintain the opinion that he and the Saints passing attack is overrated because it has real limitations, okay? So the most concerning number is Brees' average yards per completion. That's the number I always use to sort of measure where he is. That number is 10.4. That's 27th in the NFL between Kyler Murray and Daniel Jones. I went back and looked through every Super Bowl team and couldn't find any team whose quarterback averaged a lower number. I get it. Their passing game is sort of an extension of the run. His average pass travel is only 6.3 yards beyond the line of scrimmage. That's the fewest among qualified quarterbacks, but it's been that way for a while. So, not surprisingly, the Saints rank 17th in the league in explosive plays, but we know that's sort of a sacrifice that you make when playing methodically, okay? So I have a couple more sort of lesser concerns. Brees is the number 1 rated quarterback in the NFL when his team is tied or leading. But his QBR dips to 12th in the league, under 60, when the Saints are trailing. They play slower than any team in their conference, but all that changes when they can't lead anymore. And there are a handful of examples this year in which I think that's really been exaggerated, most notably, I think, that Falcons game. And lastly, the Saints rank 20th in the league in red zone offense, 23rd in goal to go, which sort of surprises me because their passing game is sort of effective in a phone booth. They lead the NFL in percentage of drives ending in field goals. So, obviously it's great to score, but I'm not sure against this sort of crowded, top-heavy NFC that's going to work much. So that's sort of my, in a nutshell, reason why I think the Saints and Drew Brees passing attack is really overrated because of some of the efficiency numbers we like to use, and completion percentage is great and all that. And look, he fills up the stat sheet in a way that is wonderful. And in some sense, he's probably the best fantasy football player ever, which I think also sort of inflates our value of him. But that's what I got.
Okay. You said a lot of things there, so I'm trying to decide where to begin. I think the red zone one is really interesting, Paul, because red zone, I'm very fascinated in general by teams, their offenses that are high efficiency or explosive or, considered to be very good offenses but struggle in the red zone. Red zone, as we know, is something that's kind of hard to repeat year to year. There's a lot of randomness, but I tend to attribute that to it's where coaching breaks down a bit and you just have to win, right? With your players. And so I think it's kind of interesting that that's somewhere that they've struggled. One of the funny things about this Saints offense, you mentioned, you're talking about the passing attack, but it's that rushing attack that's been sort of, I don't want to say it's been inconsistent, certainly down from last season, right? So I think it would stand that if I'm trying to think how much you defend the Saints offense in the postseason, given all the various limitations that you've described.
What's curious to me is that they were so good. They were the number 1 team in the NFL in the red zone and goal to go and in red zone over the last handful of seasons. So that's new, obviously, and that's, I think, definitely concerning, especially considering the packed field. And I think it's hard to overstate the value of Mark Ingram, obviously, in hindsight now. And it's pretty clear that Alvin Kamara just isn't the player he was the first couple seasons. He's still dynamic and obviously, when healthy, pretty effective. But the offense is 9 yards at a time with Michael Thomas, and I'm just not sure that's a formula that can win 3 or 4 playoff games in a row. And I'm not sure the defense is really all that equipped to either. This is a better unit than they've had there. But collectively, I'm just not going to buy into Drew Brees as still being an elite quarterback because he just doesn't do enough damage, for lack of a better term. And to play that way, 3 or 4 times in a row in the playoffs is very challenging. To put together 6, 7, 8 play drives against great teams week after week, I think it's going to be a tough pill to swallow for them. I really do.
You're saying especially if they do fall behind.
Yes, I think that number is fairly significant. Drew Brees is an outstanding quarterback. No one's disputing that. But this is sort of the Kirk Cousins dynamic in Minnesota. If you don't have the luxury of being able to run the ball and play action with that much effectiveness, it changes a lot of things. And the Saints are another team that struggles as a result of that.
You missed the first half of the show where I said Kirk Cousins versus underrated, but that also is. I do think you're not wrong to point out his weaknesses. I meant relative to perception.
Oh, he's definitely underrated this year, no doubt.
Well, all right. That's certainly a fiery, hot take, a place to start. So I'm gonna go for my first overrated thing. I'm being conceptual here. The notion that you have to get Ezekiel Elliott going to get the Cowboys offense going, or that Ezekiel Elliott is somehow the undisputed fulcrum of this offense. So, last week, Ezekiel had against the Rams, 117 yards and 2 touchdowns. It was his, I think, fifth or 600-yard game this season. And as soon as it was happening, Paul, I was already annoyed because I knew people were going to say, oh, there you go. When you get Zeke going and he gets X touches, the Cowboys, are like 5-1 or something. It drives me crazy. Okay, so for a number of reasons. One of which is Dak Prescott has been phenomenal in games this year without production from Zeke. Against Detroit, that one came to mind. He had 440 yards, 3 touchdowns, 11 adjusted yards per attempt. Zeke carried it 16 times for 45 yards. Minnesota is another one. So I think that's a fallacy, the idea that Dak, his success depends on Zeke thriving. Oh, and by the way, in this game against the Rams, Tony Pollard was more efficient than Zeke. And I think that's because, and it's the reason why. So, we talk about why does a run game work? And I subscribe to the belief that it's largely a product of offensive line and numbers and what defenses are giving you. And this was a game where the Cowboys' offensive line was unbelievably dominant. I mean, that was my big takeaway watching them against the Rams, because the Rams' pass rush, Paul, is no joke. They rank high in just about every metric this year. They're very good. And the Cowboys' line honestly made them look like high schoolers. I mean, Aaron Donald was just so minimized. And he always has struggled against Zach Martin, but even when they moved him around, he did absolutely nothing. And I think along these lines, we may have actually gotten to the point where the Cowboys' offensive line is a little bit underrated. They're second in adjusted line yards, second in adjusted sack rate, 5th in run blocking for Pro Football Focus. And, they've lost a couple guys. They lost Connor Williams. But by and large, I think they're very good. And I think there's no magic number for Ezekiel Elliott that's required to fix this Cowboys offense.
I actually agree with that in principle. This is the number 1 team in the NFL in yards per play. They rank in the top 5 in offensive efficiency. I don't think there's any honest argument to make that they're game planning ineffectively on offense. I think one of the most dishonest things that we do is just what you said. You retroactively look at the number of touches or rushes that X, Y, or Z player had and tie it into a result, when in reality, obviously, it's very dependent on the game to game circumstances. And at some point, if you've heard someone say that on TV so many times, you just believe that it's true. What I will challenge you on, to an extent, is that I do think that the Cowboys play calling has negatively impacted the defense. And this is something that I can't quite quantify, the notion of complementary football and all that. But this is an average defense per play and per drive. And this was an average defense per play and per drive before. The difference was that they just were playing less. This defense doesn't need to play better. It just needs to play less. So I'm not sure they've built a team to play this fast. That's the thing with Kellen Moore has turned this offense into playing nearly as fast as like the Cardinals and some of the teams that play at the fastest pace in the NFL. And it strikes me as being counterintuitive with in regards to how they built the team, like you said, with the offensive line and sort of by paying the running back. So I'm not so yes, offensively, the Zeke notion is a fallacy, but it is being on the field more has clearly impacted this defense in a way that I'm not sure that we would have foreseen.
So I think there's some truth to that. Like you generally, it's good for defenses when offenses aren't on the field, or when they're not going 3 and out. I think the question is how best to execute that if you're the Dallas offense, right? Because if you get a 3 and out by running the ball, you're not going to be on the field very long.
No.
Right? So really the key is optimizing that. So it's like I always quibble with people saying, well, it's all about ball control and running to stay on the field. Well, no, because if you run the ball unsuccessfully, you're going to get off the field. But what you're referring to is not just about running versus passing. You're talking about pace in general, and I think efficiency, right? And so I think you can definitely argue that this offense perhaps has not been run as efficiently as it could have been, especially in recent weeks. And some of that, by the way, is, and I've talked about this, Dak just kind of didn't execute well. Some of it was game plan, yes, but he had a couple of down weeks, but he looked, I thought, extremely sharp, and I contend it's not because of the running game. It's just the offensive line is all the way back, and he looks good as well.
He does. If they ran the exact same offense and they just took on average 2 more seconds before they snapped the ball, I wouldn't be surprised if that in and of itself made a difference. Like in the first 3 years of this Dak Zeke era, they ran the 3rd slowest offense, and this year they're running the 4th fastest offense. Like and they're doing it prolifically. I just wonder if they could still maintain that kind of effectiveness and just slow down just a little bit to
right.
bleed the
So it's
time
not
of
about
possession.
run
Right.
versus pass.
Correct.
It's about pace, which, by the way, is something I think it's kind of an understudied area with regards to different offenses and who plays better with pace and who doesn't, because there are certain offenses out there that are clearly just better with tempo. But, if it was that easy, every offense would just play tempo.
Sure, this was a thing
time.
earlier in the season that I looked up as it relates to Mitchell Trubisky. Like, the faster the Bears played, the better he did for whatever reason. And that, like you said, it is definitely an unexplored area, but I wonder how much the Cowboys have talked about that themselves. My guess is that Kellen Moore is saying this is working because we're scoring all sorts of points and Dak's breaking all these records and all the rest of it. But I wonder if the guys on the other side of the ball that are playing 32 minutes a game on defense figure differently.
Well, who's your next overrated?
My next overrated is Aaron Rodgers, which apparently is mainstream now, huh?
It's not mainstream. It's I would say it's been simmering in certain quarters of nerd football Twitter for about a year. And it feels like it's gone from simmering to boiling. So explain to us why we are now at the boiling point with Aaron Rodgers.
I worked on a monologue with Greeny last week in which we just sort of spewed 90 seconds worth of stats. So this would sort of be my in a nutshell on Aaron Rodgers. Stanzik, you like movies. I think Aaron Rodgers has become like Robert De Niro. He's extremely famous because of his accomplishment, but the public, as we know, always lags when great people, or in this case, great quarterbacks, aren't great anymore because of their celebrity and because of the muscle memory that we have in watching them be great. Okay, that's what I see when I see Aaron Rodgers. And as best I can tell, Rodgers is great at exactly one thing now, and that's just avoiding interceptions. And I guess the question that I would posit is, like, how much do we value risk aversion? Because right now, Rodgers' team punts on 44% of its drives. That ranks 27th in the league. His QBR ranks 17th. Pro Football Focus grades him as the number 11 quarterback. And the three areas in which he thrived formerly was off-schedule pocket passing, downfield throws, and then those outside the number throws. And by all three standards of measure this year, he's been below average. So, but by however you want to slice it, completion percentage or QBR or however you want to, whatever metric you choose to use, Aaron Rodgers is an average quarterback and has been for 3 years. So I guess what my question would be, like, we blame the head coach, right? So we got a new one of those, and now we have the number one pass blocking offensive line, and it seems to me that we're sort of running out of excuses for him. And when you look at it, the offensive production this year is almost exactly the same as it's been the previous previous two, in terms of their scoring and their drive percentage and their third down rate and all the things that matter. So the bottom line is that the Packers defense is a lot better. Aaron Rodgers is the same, and as a result, their record is a lot better. But this, as an individual performer, Aaron Rodgers has been an average quarterback this season, and frankly, I think over the last few years. So, what do you say?
First, on Robert De Niro, I'm 100% with that analogy, which I'm honestly too aware of, because a couple of years ago, maybe it was 1 year ago, it was 2 years ago, my in-laws were visiting, and we were like, let's watch a movie. What's on Prime Video? Want to watch something free? And we watched the movie Dirty Grandpa, which it was honestly maybe like the raunchiest movie I've ever seen. And it also was like a death pact where, like, we kept looking at each other like, who's going to turn this off first? And we watched it until the end, and it will really change the way you think about Robert De Niro. That's all I have to say about that. You're certainly right about the numbers. I think what I find, and I think you're right about the contrast between perception and production, especially over the last 3 years. I think it's so a lot of that is reputation. A lot of it is that despite, the lack of efficiency, the throwaways, the conservatism, Rodgers will still occasionally have like an insane, or mostly in the past couple of years, like some insane play that makes SportsCenter. So everyone's like, well, he could do that, right? But what I do find interesting, Paul, is, despite everything you're saying is true, Green Bay's passing offense is still 8th in DVOA. Obviously, their rushing offense is even better. And I think it's like, it invites the question, okay, if Rodgers is playing like an average quarterback, is that enough given sort of where this team is right now in terms of their defense and some of the weapons around him, and then, as you mentioned, that excellent offensive line.
I'm comfortable doing that so long as we can acknowledge what he is, and that's fairly average. But I just don't feel like we're there yet. And I think the other thing that comes into it is that he's so well compensated. He's one of the highest paid players in the league, and we always sort of attach that with this sort of badge of honor, if you will. This player makes such and such dollar figure, that therefore this player should be producing this much. I'm fine with that. I mean, a third of his passes this year are thrown at or behind the line of scrimmage. I mean, he is Alex Smith right now, and he's Alex Smith dressed up as Aaron Rodgers essentially. And so long as we're comfortable saying that, then I'm cool with it. I'm not sure that's going to be enough to give this team an opportunity to win a few playoff games. But I do agree with you that if Matt LaFleur ultimately decides and lands on Aaron Rodgers as being a game manager being good enough, then so be it. And so far it's worked fairly effectively this year, and they have a formula that works. And maybe risk aversion is the way to get him to the Super Bowl.
He's designed for him too. Which isn't like it's LaFleur's fault. He might be more conscious of Rodgers' tendencies right now than perhaps the public, because when you watch this Green Bay offense, like that's how it's built at this point. Yeah,
like when's the last time you saw one of those like artistic, beautiful, like well-timed back shoulder throws to one of these guys? I watched those. I wish him do that 5 times a day for 5 years. That doesn't happen ever again anymore. Like he just doesn't have that in his arsenal, and that was like his best thing. And obviously he's had some injuries with the calf, and he had the shoulder last year, and he's not as effective outside the pocket either. I mean, you take away a couple things that a player did great, whether it be by losing weapons or whether it be by just age. But like we're always late to the party here. So I figure we might as well be 3 years late instead of 6 years late.
Yeah, I would say also like the conservatism is something that's actually, I mean, that's honestly been around for more than 3. I mean, that's been I think a nature of his game for quite some time. The difference is that you used to have that sort of reticence and unwillingness to take those risks, especially in like the intermediate throws, paired with the explosive plays. So when the explosive plays aren't there, suddenly it becomes a huge problem.
But even when he doesn't, do that, like he still ranks at the very bottom of the league in tight window throws and things of that nature. So even when he's doing that, he's not doing that well.
I have another quarterback, and I'm not sure overrated is quite fair, but I'm still not sold on Jimmy Garoppolo. And it was something I was thinking while watching this incredible Falcons game. Because even though he didn't compile any interceptions, he should have been picked off a couple of times. And that's something he'll do, right? I would say like every other game this season, Garoppolo has several would-be picks. Now, other game, like in the Saints game right before this, he was incredible. And he is at times, I think obviously Shanahan gets a lot of credit, as he should, for scheming like the, McVay Goff offense that people thought last year. Like he makes it so easy for him. And I would say more than Brees, but probably less. His average depth of target is exceptionally low as well. He is almost always throwing from a clean pocket, and his numbers from a clean pocket, which are usually for, tell you something about whether a quarterback's going to be good, have been very good. But the interceptions, and I think the risk-taking is ultimately the only thing that I really believe could take down this Niners team, is just if Jimmy has one of these games where he puts the ball in harm's way, I think that could be their undoing.
I don't disagree with any of that, but I think one thing that is worth noting with Garoppolo, give me a guess, how many games has he started in the NFL?
20.
He started 24 games. He started a year and a half of football. He started as many games as Sam Darnold. One fewer game than Josh Allen, which is wild to think about because he's been around for so long and we just love the cut of his jib, right? But I agree with you. Like, this is such a dominant defense and such a creative running attack that I'm not sure that, like him playing the way that Drew Brees does or the way that Aaron Rodgers does actually might be the formula for them. Like this might be the scenario in which we can reconcile that. But it's hard to disagree that if like this is a team that they rely so much on the field position margin because their defense is so aggressive and effective in disrupting opposing quarterbacks and such. I'm not certain that I'm confident in him because we haven't seen it yet. Like this is still an extremely young player as far as football years are concerned. So yes, in a nutshell, I agree with the take. But if there's any of the quarterbacks that we have discussed that can afford to play conservatively in terms of it's these guys because the defense and because of the running game.
just has to put together like 3 straight dominant games for me. I don't know. I think you just kind of never know who's going to show up. And then outside of, I think the, Sanders and Samuel will go down as just phenomenal acquisitions, but he's still significantly more efficient when throwing to Kittle. All right, who's your next overrated person?
My next overrated person is the Jameis Winston turnover dynamic. This isn't to say that Jameis Winston is overrated. This is to say that Jameis Winston, the whole conversation surrounding him turning the ball over too much is overrated. Now, look, turnovers are bad, and he does it a lot. But here's my best effort at sort of disputing that as being a fatal flaw of his. I think it's easy to destroy him for the carelessness, but I think we've sort of used that so much that we've overshadowed an outstanding season. Using expected points added on pass plays, which does include interceptions. Winston is the number 5 quarterback in the NFL this season, sandwiched between Russell Wilson and Patrick Mahomes. Over the last month, Tampa has the number 2 ranked pass offense as measured by successful play rate. So he has to do a lot of it on his own, we know. 77% of Tampa's offense comes from the passing game. That's the second highest total in the league. And when accounting for his running as well, Winston is responsible for 86% of the offense, the highest of any player in the NFL. So given how little help he has, and given how much good he does do when he throws the ball to his guys, I'm not so sure that using his interception and turnover totals as sort of painting as a broad brush for Jameis Winston is fair to do. Like, we all know he's in a contract year. We all know that he has this significant flaw, but so did Brett Favre and a lot of other really great quarterbacks that were really great for a really long time. Now, he obviously is not that, but I think he's done enough to warrant another year in Tampa, to say the least.
I think it's like the second quarterback in NFL history at this point to put together back-to-back 450-yard games somewhere. So I think the idea of there being like sort of a Mendoza line for turnover-prone quarterbacks is kind of fascinating. Like, okay, we've got this guy, he doesn't take care of the football. How productive do you have to be to make it worth it? Or, where does the turnover line exist, right? And at what point would you rather have a quarterback like Jameis Winston than a conservative quarterback? He's sort of going to what we were just talking about. And obviously, I think it really depends on how the rest of your team is built. You make a really good point, I think, about the Bucs offense. That offense, I think we think of, yes, he has Evans and Godwin, and, well, they seem determined not to acknowledge the existence of O.J. Howard. But at various points, he's had these great playmakers. But outside of that, they've always had bad offensive lines and sort of up and down running game. So it's not like he was put in this like tremendous position, right?
No,
he
but
has
by no means.
had to be extremely, and that's part of the reason why, by the way, I think he plays hero ball so much. Now, some of those tendencies stayed to college, and I don't think at this point James Winston is not changing. He is always going to be this guy. His brain is, he throws into triple coverage several times a game. But I think though, like from a roster construction standpoint, and as you mentioned, the Bucs are kind of going to this critical point where they're going to have to decide what to do. Do we franchise him? Do we extend him? It really is a fascinating debate because you're not wrong, I think, about his productivity relative to the turnovers. But that productivity is not always consistent, and it has not been over the course of his career to this point. It's funny, Paul, when I was talking about, I've talked about Winston versus Mariota a lot on this podcast, and where Mariota, it was like literally game to game, play to play, a different guy. Winston would have like 4 to 5 game stretches where he was incredible, and then 2 to 3 game stretches where he was bad. And so that would be my biggest concern, I think, is just like the patchiness of his productivity, even though I do agree, as you say, if he can be that productive, it probably makes the turnovers worth it. It
does. Like So Winston right now ranks 16th in QBR and Rodgers ranks 17th, right? And they couldn't have stat lines that are any more different. So if we're looking for sort of like the break-even point, like they're both about league average by QBR, and one is obviously risk averse, as we talked about, throwing a third of his passes as screens, and the other one is literally chucking the other one's Allen Iverson, right? So It depends on how you want to take your production. Now, personally, I probably favor someone like Rodgers because I know he's not going to kill me, right? And we obviously have the track record there. But I think right now, Jameis Winston's a player who is sort of playing with a reputation, right? The same way that Aaron Rodgers does, and it's really easy for us to see the turnovers and remember those, right? But you know, the good plays count too, and he has a lot more of those this year than Aaron Rodgers, and a lot more than a lot of other quarterbacks, and he's frankly, you know, sort of slugging along a roster that is sort of inferior. I mean, Bruce Arians said today that they need to get the running game involved a lot more. So he's having an underappreciated season despite turning the ball over nearly 30 times, as wild as that is to say.
So my last topic, before we get to questions, is honestly total BS, because I'm not really saying something's overrated. I'm saying the idea of something is overrated. And that idea is that the Chiefs' very bad run defense is going to kill them in the playoffs. And they are, let me be clear, very bad, right? They're 30th in DVOA. I was pulling up their numbers since week 10 to see if they have improved, and they are not. They continue to be terrible, near the bottom of the league in most metrics. But there are a couple of reasons why I don't think it's a huge problem. One is that the pass defense has been sneaky awesome. So I guess I should have done an underrated Chiefs pass defense, but that's neither here nor there. In fact, since week 10, they rank first in opposing QBR. The last few games against New England, Oakland, Denver, granted not exactly a murderer's row of passing offenses, they have been phenomenal. You're starting to hear like Honey Badger Defensive Player of the Year buzz, which I think is frankly insane. But what Steve Spagnuolo has done with that secondary relative to last season has been really impressive. So there's that. And then the other thing is, Paul, you know, the reason why you're going to start hearing about the Chiefs' run defense being a problem is that, well, the number one seed in the AFC is the most potent rushing attack we have seen in a bazillion years. And that would, of course, be Baltimore. But I don't think it's a big problem because, one, they actually played the run pretty well when the two teams met. And two, I don't think you can beat Baltimore by being a great run defense. I think the only way you beat them is by scoring a ton of points. And the Chiefs are the best suited offense to do that in the AFC. So I think it's actually a pretty decent matchup for them, and I'm not terribly worried.
Yes, the Chiefs aren't going to lose to the Ravens or anyone else in the playoffs because their defense couldn't get off the field in the second half because, you know, they're being bludgeoned on the ground. I know that's a very football-y thing to say, but it's not. I mean, this defense is a lot better than it was a year ago when they were one play away from going to the Super Bowl. They're 15th in efficiency.
Yeah.
No one's. I mean, they're obviously the rush defense isn't good by any stretch of the imagination, but that's not the kind of thing that kills teams in the NFL in 2019. And I think that's why in a game like Ravens Chiefs, it's going to matter so much who can score early, because if the Ravens can impose their will on anybody, you know, and then the Chiefs, what the Chiefs have done a lot more lately, you know, during this 4-game win streak, they've gone to 6 defensive backs a lot more, and as a result, obviously that's because teams are throwing the ball against them because they're playing from behind. You know, it's a tale as old as time. But if the Chiefs are forced to play their base defense, are going to get obliterated because they can't stop the run doing that. So it sounds like an oversimplification, but I think ultimately the first quarter is going to determine who wins that football game.
Well, I think, by the way, your point about the Chiefs pass defense, and like, I think it's really important to note that last year, by the end of the year, they had good numbers too, but a lot of it was because teams were playing from behind and because they had a very good pass rush. They actually don't have a great pass rush this year. It's the secondary, which is really interesting to me. And it's not being skewed by game situation either. Like, they're just playing well. So, I just think they're, as you said, they're just a much better unit. They're still not one of the better overall. They're still not one of the better defenses in the league. But I think this year, especially if Mahomes looks like he did on Sunday, it could be good enough.
Yes, it could be.
Yeah.
And this Ravens team, for example, just to pin these two teams, I mean, this team's going to rush for 3,000 yards. Like, no one's done that in a 16 game season. Like, no one's averaged 200 yards a game on the ground in a 16 game season. They're historically good, and everyone knows that. So, but you're still not going to win or lose a football game in the playoffs solely because of it. You've hit the nail right on the head here. If that's the right way to say that, the Chiefs are going to be able to. I think the Chiefs are going to be able to score. The Chiefs are going to be able to score in the playoffs, and the first quarter is going to determine the outcome of that game. The defense last year was was dreadful. We forget. The defense last year was dreadful. Yes, it may have came around a little bit later, but like if you watch them in the playoffs, like Brady looks like actual Brady, right? Like that was absolutely their Achilles heel, and they were still almost good enough. I'm not sure the offense is quite as good. That's a different discussion for another day, but I agree with your premise.
Well, I think it all depends on Mahomes' health. Because even, like I said, he looked a lot better, but in the prior game even though they beat New England, he was clutching his ribs and he's just not been right all season. But if he rounds into health at the right time, I think this team is dangerous. All right. Speaking of dangerous, we're going to get to my questions. But first, hiring is challenging. But there's one place you can go where hiring is simple, fast, and smart, and where growing businesses can connect qualified candidates. Quotable co-founder Gretchen Huebner experienced how challenging hiring can be after unsuccessfully searching for a new game artist to grow with her education tech company. But then, she switched to ZipRecruiter and saw an immediate difference. And you can too by signing up for free at ZipRecruiter.com/Mina. ZipRecruiter doesn't depend on candidates finding you, it finds them for you. And by using ZipRecruiter's screening questions to filter candidates, Gretchen found it easier to focus on the best ones, then find the right one. In fact, after posting her job on ZipRecruiter, Gretchen said she was honestly surprised she found qualified candidates so quickly and hired a new game artist in less than 2 weeks. With results like that, it's no wonder 4 out of 5 employers who post on ZipRecruiter get a quality candidate within the first day. ZipRecruiter, the smartest way to hire. See why ZipRecruiter is effective for businesses of all sizes. Try ZipRecruiter for free at our web address, ZipRecruiter.com/Mina. That's ZipRecruiter.com/Mina. MINA.
And now it's time for Dinks and Dunks. I'm getting paid for this, right?
All right, Paul, as always, 5 questions. 5th one is from my dog, Lenny. I didn't write it. He did, so I apologize in advance. First question. So I know you're a baseball guy. You've got a baseball background. You work on the baseball show. When will my Mariners win the World Series?
Oof. Well, right now,
Give me a year.
2040. Because it's not going to happen with the current group that's there. So I'm just going to throw a number out there. So you have to wait 21 more years, and that's just an arbitrary number. Just taking a while.
Nope. I'm holding you to it.
Okay.
I'm setting a Google account reminder to ask you what happened.
All right.
I'll be 50. That's fine. That's not too old. I'll still enjoy that.
That gives time for Ichiro's
I'll
grandkids to mature and become great players.
Question 2. What is the take you've had that you've regretted the most?
Ooh. That Marcus Mariota would be an all-pro quarterback. I died on that hill. You
know what, though? Honestly, no. You know what? He could have been if a couple things had gone differently. I maintain that it was his injury in, 2017? It was his second year. That really sort of brought.
I don't know. I mean, like Ryan Tannehill is literally Joe Montana right now. He's Sammy Baugh, and in the same offense. So I think that ship has sailed. Like today was probably the first time I publicly acknowledged that Jameis Winston is way better, and I would have never imagined saying that even 2 years ago.
No, you're right. You're not wrong. Question 3. The holidays are coming up. What is the best gift you ever received as a child?
A Nintendo 64, and that's a very generic answer, but I ended up playing like Madden so much that I had to blow the cartridge and do all sorts of things to preserve it. But that's sort of how I learned football, like a lot of the rest of us. And I also suffered a minor thumb injury at one point from
brutal.
My left thumb. I was day to day for a while, but I was able to still do all the stuff I needed to in gym class.
You should bring that up if anyone says you never played the game. So I wasn't allowed to have game systems growing up. Korean mom. And so but my brother and I have an older brother, Isaac, we would play a lot at other people's houses. In fact, we were so cruelly deprived of game systems. There was like a game store, I want to say it was a GameStop, near our house when we were small, and they used to let you play there. So we would just go there and play on the N64 for hours. It's kind of crazy that they let us do that for free. I wonder if we... Yeah.
How'd you spend all your time? Did you have to play like a bunch of instruments or do a lot of reading? Like how did you occupy your afternoon?
No, my parents weren't too hard on the instrument front. So I don't play like string instruments like the stereotypes. But it was just like a lot of homework, clubs, that kind of thing. I played soccer too, so that was but just weren't allowed to have a game system. That was a big one for us.
Look, you
I had a
turned out
Game Boy.
Okay.
Thank you.
For travel? Like
I was very good at Game Boy.
In the van?
We got them for free.
The road trips? Okay.
Question 4. Which get up guest, I don't know what they call them, the people on the Get Up, uses your services the most and who uses them the least?
Bobby Carpenter uses them the most. Like
really?
I could say any statistic. And Bobby Carpenter would repeat. I could say Jameis Winston won his third World Series last night, and it would be in the A block. It would be the first thing that he said. Who uses them the least? It's a good question. Damian Woody Damian Woody will come up to me before the show and like ask for a couple things and then attempt to regurgitate like one of them at like 9:30 and like get the team wrong and the stat and maybe the rank. So, I've sort of had to massage, give him some more like conceptual stuff. But,
Woody,
but like, he played football as you might know. So, he doesn't need the numbers to match the eye test.
Woody's been a guest on, the Mina show.
He's a good man.
Lenny. He's got a female dog named Tiffany who Lenny is always hollering at.
Is that right?
Speaking of Lenny, he's got a question for you. It's a trivia question. He knows you do trivia. He wrote this, not me. He wants to know if you're aware of which quarterback leads the league in BOFA.